Okay, American history, we're on chapter 26, affluence and anxiety in the atomic age. Affluence because America was left relatively unscathed after World War II, and the rest of the world, much of it is in ruins, and it puts us in a unique position where the economy is just absolutely booming, especially in the 1950s and into the 60s. And it leads to much more affluence or wealth for the average American family than at any other time in our history before that. Throughout the 50s, but then there's the anxiety because of the threat of nuclear war and the atomic age and the beginning of the Cold War. Eisenhower, the hero of D-Day, is going to be elected president, finally breaking the monopoly of Democrats controlling the White House since FDR was elected in 1932. And so one of the biggest things that Eisenhower gets accomplished is the interstate highway system. And you see this post-war prosperity and GIs coming home. It's the beginning of the baby boom and suburbia. But one of the things you'll see is not everyone benefits from this. For one thing, there's a big step back for women because women were expected, even though Rosie the Riveter is working in the factories of World War II, they're expected to go back home. And for them, they're like, no. I know there's that, first of all, you keep telling me I can't do these jobs, yet I was building tanks and airplanes when you needed me to. Don't tell me I can't do these jobs and I'm supposed to just stay in the home. And it's going to be the very beginning of the feminist movement, which is really going to take off in the 60s. But it was that restrictive environment in the 50s that's going to just push women to finally push for greater equality, which we're still working on today. So that's a big part of it as well. But a lot of this chapter too is, of course, about the early years of the civil rights movement. The first thing I want you to understand is why the civil rights movement is necessary, and I can't emphasize it enough. If you were in my class, I'd read the story from a book called The Dark End of the Street, and there's a couple of African-American women walking home from church. A group of 5 white men in a car pull over. They basically kidnap one of the women, they take her and they rape her. And it's a sad, terrible story. There is nobody to turn to. You can't call the police. Nobody's going to do anything. They call Rosa Parks. She was an activist. Long before she ever refused to give up her seat, she had been an activist with the NAACP for fighting for justice for these types of situations, which was an almost impossible task. Virtually no one was convicted, no white man had ever been convicted of raping a black woman prior to the civil rights movement. Just wasn't going to happen. They weren't going to convict. Emmett Till is a good example. Emmett Till was a 13-year-old boy that went to visit an uncle in Mississippi, and he was murdered. Everybody knew who did it, and yet they were found not guilty. The whole system was set up that way. You lived in constant fear that at any time that something could be done to you and there would be no justice. And so it's not just about integrating schools. That's important, sure. It's not just about integrating juries and having the right to vote. It's the entire system was set up in such a way that was absolutely brutal towards African Americans. And the point of the civil rights movement was to try to create this equality and fight back. But it's a difficult task. And it begins, well, oftentimes Rosa Parks is seen as the beginning of it, the Montgomery bus boycott. That's when we're first introduced to Martin Luther King Jr. He's a young preacher that comes and helps to lead the Montgomery bus boycott. So that's part of it, is the tactics of the civil rights movement. Boycotts was one tactic. Sit-ins was another one. Voter registration drives, marches, protests. You'd also have something called the Freedom Rides, which was an extraordinary, courageous, or even dangerous or stupid thing to do as they tried to integrate bathroom facilities within the South. the system of segregation, I think oftentimes people don't completely understand how strict it was. And there's a great book called Caste, where the author compares the caste systems of India, Nazi Germany, and the United States. And there's so many similarities to all three of them. And among those is like purity. And that's why you had these laws where you didn't have interracial marriages. That wasn't overturned by the Supreme Court till 1969, because you weren't supposed to have children together, because that would create an impure society, a mongrel race. Of course, that doesn't mean that that didn't happen. It happened a lot through, especially through rape, historically, all through the age of slavery. But the idea was that they're not pure, that black people are so far inferior that they could corrupt the gene pool of the white race. And it's so terrible. In her book, Caste, the historian recounts many instances, for example, when African American kids would swim in the white swimming pool like at night and then had been caught. And upon having found that had happened, the townspeople then drained the swimming pool and then refilled the water because they did not want to be contaminated. It just shows you the extent of how ludicrous the whole thing was. And so we tend to think of, I got 7 minutes, of the civil rights movement as a happy ending. People will cite often like Martin Luther King Jr. and say, well, they just, Martin Luther King Jr., what frustrates me is they look at Martin Luther King Jr. as this hero, which he is, but what they don't understand is he was hated in his day. I mean, that's why he was assassinated, because he was so reviled and hated. Martin Luther King Jr. would definitely have been taking a knee with Colin Kaepernick. I promise you that. So this idea that King was this, there's a whole book on this, on how his legacy has been completely whitewashed to fit a narrative that they all lived happily ever after. And that's just not true. If you look at the Little Rock Nine as well, the resistance to integration was so strong. It's unbelievable how strong that they continued to resist all of this. And it's really frustrating too, because this isn't over. I mean, what is the deal now about teaching about slavery or about teaching about the civil rights movement? Now we have laws passed to ban critical race theory. But what it is it's a backlash against trying to actually teach what happened. None of those things came out until you had Black Lives Matter and George Floyd. And then all of a sudden there's this reactionary backlash to that. And it's really frustrating because that backlash, I promise you, is the same type of backlash that was against Martin Luther King Jr., the same type of backlash that was against the Little Rock Nine integrating those schools. I promise you that. And so the cycle continues. Also in this chapter is the beginning of Vietnam as well. So what you see is you see some things where things begin, like with the civil rights movement, which is going to keep going, of course, through the 60s and all the way through today. And you see the beginning of things like Vietnam, which is going to continue all the way through the 70s, and its reverberations are still felt today. So there's a lot in this chapter. I hope you learn a lot and study it carefully, because so much of this history certainly shapes our present today.